The scorching Texas sun beat down on the quiet roadside gas station, dust swirling in lazy spirals as a black SUV rolled to a stop. 3 men stepped out, their boots crunching against the gravel, tattoos snaked up their arms, pistols resting heavy on their belts. They thought today would be just like any other: intimidate, steal, and disappear into the desert. But they had no idea the old man they were about to threaten wasn't just some quiet farmer. He was a legend, a ghost from the past, the deadliest gunslinger Texas had ever known. And today, they had just picked the wrong man to mess with. The sun hung low in the sky, stretching long shadows across the endless Texas plains. A small, dusty gas station stood at the crossroads of nowhere, a relic of another time. Its faded sign creaked in the wind, and the only sound was the rhythmic buzzing of an old neon light flickering above the door. Inside, behind the counter, sat a man who looked like he belonged to the land itself. His name was Samuel Hayes, but folks around here just called him Sam. He was pushing 70, his beard streaked with silver, his skin weathered by the years. He wore a worn-out Stetson, his plaid shirt rolled up at the sleeves, revealing the sinewy strength that still lingered in his arms. To anyone passing through, Sam looked like just another old rancher, a man content to run his little gas station, sip his coffee, and watch the world move on without him. But those who had lived in these parts long enough knew better. They whispered stories about the man behind the counter, tales of a time when he wasn't just a simple farmer, but the fastest gun in the West, the kind of man who could draw, shoot, and holster before his enemy even realized he was dead. But Sam wasn't that man anymore. Or at least, that's what he told himself. The bell above the gas station door jingled, and in walked Maria, the local waitress from the diner down the road. "Morning, Sam," she greeted, setting a fresh-baked pie on the counter. "Thought you could use some company." Sam chuckled. "Pie's company enough for me," he said, tipping his hat. Before Maria could respond, a deep, guttural rumble rolled in from the highway. A black SUV pulled up, dust kicking up in thick clouds around it. The doors opened and 3 men stepped out, their presence poisoning the peaceful morning air. The way they walked, their swagger, their smirks, Sam knew trouble when he saw it, and trouble had just walked through his door. The door swung open, and the 3 men strutted inside like they owned the place. The scent of motor oil and dust mixed with the rich aroma of fresh coffee. Sam's grip tightened around his mug, but his expression remained unreadable. He'd seen men like these before, cocky, reckless, believing themselves untouchable. The leader, a man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, surveyed the small gas station with an unimpressed smirk. His name was Javier El Lobo Cortez, and in the back alleys of Nuevo Laredo, his name sent shivers down men's spines. He wasn't just any thug. He was a lieutenant in a dangerous cartel, a man who thrived on fear and violence. Behind him stood Luis and Carlos, 2 enforcers built like bulls. Their arms were covered in tattoos, their hands resting near the pistols tucked beneath their jackets. Javier walked up to the counter, leaning in close. "Morning, abuelo," he said in a voice dripping with mockery. "How's business?" Sam didn't flinch. He took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the mug down. "Can't complain." His voice was calm, steady. He wasn't rattled. He was reading them, calculating. Maria tensed beside him, gripping her tray tighter. She knew these weren't the kind of men you joked around with. Javier chuckled, running a hand over the counter as if inspecting its quality. "You see, we've been expanding our interests in these parts, and we like to keep things safe for people like you. Protection, you understand?" Sam exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Not interested." Javier's smirk widened. "See, that's the wrong answer, old man. Because what happens when someone comes through here and—" He picked up a glass salt shaker from the counter and smashed it against the wood. "Causes a little trouble." The sound echoed in the small station. Maria gasped, stepping back. Sam, however, barely blinked. Javier leaned in even closer. "We wouldn't want that, would we?" For the first time, Sam looked him dead in the eyes. His gaze was like cold steel, cutting through the bravado. "You want to know the difference between a real wolf and a stray dog, son?" His voice was low, almost conversational. "A stray will bark, growl, make all the noise in the world, hoping it scares something. But a wolf," he leaned forward slightly, "a wolf doesn't need to prove itself. It just waits for the right moment to strike. A tense silence settled over the room. Luis shifted uneasily, his fingers twitching near his gun. Carlos glanced at Javier, waiting for his reaction. Javier's smirk faltered for a second before he forced a laugh. "You got guts, viejo, I'll give you that." He turned toward Maria. "Maybe you can convince your friend here to cooperate, huh? Be a shame if something happened to this nice little place." Maria swallowed hard, glancing at Sam. He was still calm, but there was a different energy now. Something in the air had changed. Sam reached behind the counter, and in a smooth motion, he placed something on the wood. A worn leather gun holster. Javier's eyes flicked to it, and for the first time there was hesitation. "You want to talk about protection," Sam said, his voice still steady. "Let me tell you a little story." Javier scoffed. "What is this story time?" But Sam ignored him. "A long time ago, a man made a name for himself in Texas. They called him the Widow Maker. Said he could put a bullet through a man's eye at 50 yards before the poor fool even touched his gun. Said he once took out 6 men before his boots even touched the ground." Carlos's jaw tensed. Luis shifted again, now clearly uncomfortable. Sam continued. "That man disappeared, left the life behind, bought himself a gas station, figured maybe the world had forgotten about him. He finally looked up, his icy blue eyes locking onto Javier's. Guess he was wrong." A cold chill ran through the room. Luis muttered something under his breath in Spanish. Carlos stepped back slightly. Javier clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching. "You think some old legend is supposed to scare me?" Sam exhaled, shaking his head. "No, but reality should." He moved faster than their eyes could track. In one fluid motion, he yanked the old revolver from the holster and cocked it, the click echoing in the silent gas station. Javier and his men froze. Sam hadn't even pointed it at them. He didn't need to. The speed, the confidence, the absolute certainty in his movement told them everything they needed to know. They had just made the worst mistake of their lives. Javier's smirk twitched as he tried to mask the creeping unease settling into his gut. His men had gone rigid, their hands hovering near their pistols, but none of them dared to make the first move. Sam, however, remained perfectly still, his hand resting on the revolver like it was an extension of his own body. His eyes never wavered, never blinked. He wasn't bluffing. Javier cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "You got a quick hand, viejo? I'll give you that. But quick don't mean nothing if 3 guns are pointed at you." Sam exhaled slowly, his grip unwavering. "You know what the biggest difference is between you and me?" His voice was eerily calm, like a man who'd already run through every possible outcome in his head. "You pull that trigger, and you pray you hit something. I pull mine." He tapped the barrel lightly against the wooden counter. "And I know exactly where my bullet's going." Luis swallowed hard, his fingers twitching. "Jefe," he muttered in Spanish. "No es buen idea. This ain't a good idea." Javier shot him a glare. "Shut up." But his voice lacked the usual bite. He turned back to Sam, his bravado cracking. "You think you can take all 3 of us before we put you down?" Sam's eyes flickered toward Maria, who stood frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. He could feel the weight of the moment, the sheer gravity of what was about to unfold. His voice dropped even lower, nearly a whisper. "Son, you're still assuming you'd get the chance to fire." The words hit like a hammer. Carlos shifted uncomfortably, his pulse visibly hammering in his neck. He wasn't a coward, but he wasn't stupid either. He had heard stories. Stories of men who walked through hell and came back with eyes as cold as the steel in their hands. Sam had that look. Javier's jaw clenched. He hated this feeling, the creeping sensation that he was no longer in control. He had walked into this dusty little gas station expecting an easy shakedown, a quick intimidation job, maybe some easy cash. Instead, he had stumbled into a lion's den wearing a paper crown. "You're bluffing," he said, but the words felt hollow. "Ain't no way some washed-up cowboy can take all of us before we—" Sam moved. It was subtle, a shift of weight, a slight flex of his wrist, but to trained eyes, it spoke volumes. The air in the gas station turned electric, an unspoken signal that this was the last moment to make a choice. Carlos was the first to crack. He took a step back, his hands slowly raising from his belt. "Nah, man, I'm out. I ain't dying in no gas station over some bullshit." Luis hesitated, Glancing between Javier and Sam, sweat beading along his temple, his instincts screamed at him to do the same, to step away, to leave, to forget this place and never come back. Javier's pride, however, was a heavier weight than common sense. His fingers twitched toward his gun. "You walk out on me, you're dead." Sam's grip tightened ever so slightly. "So's the first man who reaches." Silence. Maria barely dared to breathe. She could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator behind her, the distant chirping of crickets outside. The world felt suspended, hanging in the space between action and consequence. Javier stared at Sam, his mind racing. The wrong move would mean a bullet between his eyes, but backing down, that was its own kind of death. His men were already wavering, already questioning. If he left now, he lost his reputation, his power. He exhaled sharply, a mixture of rage and calculation twisting his expression. Then, with exaggerated slowness, he lifted his hands off his belt and stepped back. Sam didn't relax. Not yet. He didn't lower the gun. His eyes flicked to Luis and Carlos, making sure they followed. Carlos was already near the door. "You got a death wish, Jefe. Man's been ready to shoot you since you walked in." Luis hesitated, then gave a small nod before stepping away as well. Javier's jaw worked, his mind churning through all the ways this situation had turned against him. Finally, he spat on the floor. "This ain't over, viejo." Sam's expression remained unreadable. "Son, it was over the moment you stepped inside." Javier locked eyes with him for one last second before turning on his heel and walking out. Carlos and Luis followed, neither of them looking back. The bell above the door jingled softly as it swung shut behind them. Only when the roar of their motorcycles faded into the distance did Sam finally lower his gun. Maria exhaled shakily, pressing a hand to her chest. "Jesus, Sam." Sam simply picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and set it back down. "You think they'll be back?" she asked. He considered it for a moment, then shook his head. "Not unless they're dumber than they look." Maria let out a nervous laugh, still processing what had just happened. Sam, however, just reached for a rag and wiped a bit of coffee off the counter, like it was any other morning. But something had changed. The next time trouble came looking for an easy target, it'd think twice before stopping at this gas station. Javier rode in silence, his hands gripping the handlebars of his motorcycle so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The cool desert wind did little to soothe the burn of humiliation crawling under his skin. He had never backed down before. Never. Yet here he was, retreating from a gas station like a whipped dog, all because of some old man who had barely moved. The worst part, he knew Sam hadn't been bluffing. That single fact gnawed at his pride more than anything else. Carlos rode beside him, occasionally glancing over, no doubt waiting for the explosion of anger that would inevitably come. Luis followed a few yards behind, his silence even heavier than Javier's. The gas station lights disappeared behind them as they roared down the deserted highway, but the tension remained thick between them. Finally, after several miles, Javier pulled off onto a dirt road leading to an abandoned lot, kicking up a cloud of dust as he cut the engine. The others followed, but neither spoke. The only sound was the clicking of cooling engines and the distant howls of coyotes in the night. Javier swung off his bike and took a deep breath before turning to face his men. His voice was quiet but laced with venom. "So, that's it? We just ride away like cowards?" Carlos snorted, shaking his head. "Man, that wasn't some ordinary old guy. You saw him? Same as I did. That look, that wasn't fear. That was a man who's seen real violence, who's done things we can't even imagine." Javier's teeth clenched. "So, you saying we should let him make fools out of us?" Luis, usually the quieter of the three, finally spoke. "I'm saying we should think, man. That guy, he didn't even break a sweat. I don't know what he's done in his past, but I know that if we'd made a move, at least one of us wouldn't be standing here right now." Javier paced, kicking a rock into the dirt. His pulse still hammered in his ears. He knew they were right, but that didn't mean he was ready to swallow it. He needed something, someone to blame for the fact that he had just been forced to retreat. That's when a thought hit him. His gaze flicked up, dark eyes burning with renewed anger. "You know who's to blame for this?" Carlos frowned. "Who?" Javier's lip curled. "The girl." Luis blinked. "Maria? What the hell are you talking about?" "She's the reason we went in there in the first place," Javier spat. "She's the one who made us look weak in front of that old man." And I guarantee you, she's the reason he stood up to us in the first place. His fingers twitched at his side, as if itching to reach for his gun. So maybe we send a message. Carlos exchanged a wary glance with Luis. What kind of message? Javier grinned, but there was no humor in it. The kind that reminds people what happens when they disrespect us. We find her. We make an example out of her. Then we'll see how calm that old man is when he realizes he can't protect everyone. Carlos hesitated. I don't know, man. That sounds like a good way to make things worse. Javier stepped closer, voice a low growl. You scared? Carlos stiffened. I ain't scared of nothing. I'm just saying, that dude ain't normal. This could backfire. Javier smirked. Then we don't give him a chance to react. We hit fast and we hit hard. That way, next time we roll into town, people remember who really runs things. Luis sighed heavily, but nodded. Fine. But we do this clean. No killing. Javier rolled his eyes but waved a dismissive hand. Yeah, just enough to make her understand. Carlos still looked uneasy, but he said nothing more. The choice had been made. The question now wasn't if they would strike. It was when. Back at the gas station, Maria wiped down the counters, her hands still shaking slightly. The weight of what had just happened hadn't fully settled in yet. She had seen plenty of fights in her life, plenty of tough guys swaggering in like they owned the place. But this had felt different. Sam had barely spoken, barely moved, yet the atmosphere had shifted around him like he had commanded the very air in the room. She turned to him, still seated at the counter, his coffee cup now half empty. Sam, she murmured, voice hushed. Who are you? Sam looked up, his eyes tired but sharp. For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally, he exhaled and pushed his cup away. Just a man trying to live in peace. Maria didn't press him further. Maybe she didn't want to know. Outside, the wind howled through the empty plains. The night stretched on, quiet but heavy with something unseen. Miles away, 3 men revved their engines, their minds set on revenge. The night was restless, a low wind whistling through the open plains as Sam sat on his porch, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. He hadn't spoken much after what happened at the gas station, but Maria knew he was thinking, calculating. She had seen men like that before. Men who measured the weight of every moment, every breath, every decision, as if the future was always teetering on the edge of a blade. Sam didn't fidget, didn't pace. He simply sat there, his hands resting on his thighs, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. But Maria could feel it. Something in the air had changed. She stepped outside, hesitating for a moment before sitting down on the porch steps, hugging her knees. Are they coming back? She asked, not really needing an answer. Sam exhaled slowly, his gaze not shifting from the horizon. Men like that don't walk away from humiliation without trying to take something back, he said, his voice calm, almost resigned. Maria's stomach twisted. She had grown up around men who used fear like a currency, who walked into rooms expecting obedience, who left scars that never quite healed. She had seen it all before. I don't want to be the reason for trouble, she murmured, staring at her bare feet on the wooden planks. You're not, Sam replied simply. They were looking for an excuse. You just gave them one. Maria bit her lip, forcing herself to ask the question she had been too afraid to voice earlier. Who are you, Sam? Really? For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, with a sigh, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. A long time ago, I was someone people called when they needed problems solved. When bad men needed to disappear, he said, his tone heavy with something unreadable. I was very, very good at what I did. He let the words hang between them, giving her time to absorb their weight. Maria felt her throat tighten. And now, Sam let out a short, humorless chuckle. And now I run a gas station. The silence between them stretched long, the wind playing with strands of Maria's hair. She wasn't naive. She had seen things, understood things, but there was something unsettling about the way Sam spoke. Not with arrogance, not with regret, but with the cold neutrality of a man who had long made peace with what he was. She swallowed hard. What happens if they come back? Sam tilted his head, considering. Then I remind them why men like me aren't meant to be disturbed. Across town, Javier and his crew were preparing. They had spent the last hour going over the plan, making sure every move was precise. They weren't just going to scare Maria, they were going to humiliate her, make her regret standing up to them. A little fear, a little pain, and by the end of the night, she'd learn her place. Javier zipped up his leather jacket, checking his gun before sliding it into the waistband of his jeans. "We go in, fast and quiet. No unnecessary noise. We teach the girl a lesson and disappear before the old man even knows what happened," he said, eyes flicking between Luis and Carlos. Carlos still looked uneasy, but he nodded, as if trying to convince himself it was the right move. Luis cracked his knuckles, already looking forward to the chaos. "Let's do this." They mounted their bikes, engines roaring to life as they sped toward Maria's house, unaware that Sam was already waiting. The stars stretched wide above the desert, and in the distance a storm was brewing. The night stretched long and unforgiving, the wind whispering through the dry fields as Sam sat unmoving on his porch, his rifle propped against the wooden railing. He had been through enough wars, enough fights to recognize the feeling in the air, the kind of silence that preceded violence, the kind of quiet that wrapped itself around a man's throat, warning him of what was to come. Maria sat just inside the doorway, hugging her arms to her chest. She could see the tension in Sam's shoulders, the way his fingers rested near his gun, the way his eyes never left the road. It was like watching a coiled snake, waiting to strike. "You sure they'll come?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sam's jaw tightened. "I don't believe in luck," he said simply. "Men like them, they don't let things go." She swallowed, glancing at the old truck parked in the driveway. "We could leave," she suggested, knowing before she even said the words that it wasn't an option. Sam exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You can't run from men like that. They follow. They take your fear as an invitation." His words settled like dust between them, heavy and inescapable. Maria pressed her lips together, nodding. She had been running her whole life, always looking over her shoulder, always waiting for the past to catch up. Maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to fight. Sam reached into his pocket, pulling out a small metal object. He turned it over between his fingers, lost in thought. "I used to know a man," he murmured. "Had a family, a farm, just like this. One night, some men came looking for trouble. He tried to talk his way out of it." Sam let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Didn't work." Maria waited, feeling the weight of his story settle around them. "What happened?" she asked. Sam's fingers tightened around the object in his hand. He stopped talking. The sound of motorcycles cut through the stillness of the night, engines growling like wild animals in the distance. Maria's breath hitched. "That's them," she whispered. Sam didn't move. "Yeah," he said softly. He reached for his rifle, checking the chamber with the ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times before. He stood, stretching his shoulders, his movements slow and deliberate. "Go inside," he told her. Maria hesitated. "Sam, inside," he repeated, his voice steady. Maria bit her lip but did as she was told, stepping back into the house, the door left slightly ajar. Through the crack, she could see Sam standing on the porch, waiting. The motorcycles roared closer, headlights slicing through the darkness as Javier and his men pulled into the driveway. The tires crunched against the gravel as the engines cut off, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Sam watched as Javier swung off his bike, his leather jacket creaking as he adjusted his belt. Luis and Carlos followed, their eyes scanning the house, the shadows. "Well, well," Javier drawled, his lips twisting into a smirk. "Didn't think you'd still be up, old man." Sam didn't blink. "Didn't think you'd be dumb enough to come back," Javier chuckled, shaking his head. "You got a mouth on you," he said. "Figured we'd come back, finish what we started. Teach that girl of yours a lesson." He took a slow step forward. "Or maybe teach you one instead." Sam remained still, his rifle resting against his shoulder, his gaze steady. "You really want to do this?" he asked, his voice calm. Javier's grin widened. "Oh, I do." Behind him, Luis and Carlos shifted, their hands hovering near their belts, near the weapons hidden in the folds of their jackets. Sam exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "I was hoping you'd say that." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and leathers, of sweat and gasoline. Maria gripped the edge of the doorframe, her heart pounding. She had seen men posture, she had seen them threaten. But this This was different. Sam wasn't bluffing. He wasn't warning. He was waiting. And Javier had no idea what he had just walked into. Javier took another step forward, the smug grin never leaving his face. "I'll give you one chance, old man," he said, tilting his head. "Will you walk inside, hand over the girl, and maybe, just maybe, I'll let you keep that gas station of yours?" His voice was coated with arrogance, dripping with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. Sam sighed, rolling his shoulders, his expression one of pure indifference. "You got a lot of words, boy," he muttered. "I'm wondering if you've got anything else." The slight smirk that flickered across Sam's lips sent an uneasy ripple through the group, but Javier's bravado remained intact. He chuckled, turning toward his men, as if to confirm the absurdity of the situation. "Are you hearing this?" he scoffed. "This old man thinks he's some kind of hero." Luis, shifting on his feet, laughed too, but it was forced. There was something about the way Sam stood, the way he spoke. No fear, no hesitation, that sent a sliver of doubt crawling up his spine. "Javier," Carlos muttered, just loud enough for his leader to hear. "Maybe we should—" "Shut up!" Javier snapped, his eyes never leaving Sam. He pointed a finger at the old man. "How you don't scare me." Sam nodded slowly, like a teacher disappointed in a student who just couldn't seem to understand the lesson. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, not raising it, not yet, but making sure every man in front of him saw exactly where it was pointed. "I don't need to scare you," he said simply. "You've already made the worst mistake of your life." Javier's grin wavered for the first time, just a fraction. But Sam caught it. He saw the twitch in his fingers, the slight shift in his stance. This wasn't a man prepared for a real fight. This was a bully used to easy victories. And tonight, he'd finally found a fight he couldn't win. "You want to know something about me?" Sam asked, stepping forward just enough to make Javier tense. "I've seen men like you before. Loud, proud, all talk until the first bullet flies. Then they start begging." His green eyes locked onto Javier's with an intensity that could cut glass. "I wonder which one you'll be." The tension in the air grew thick, suffocating. Maria, still pressed against the inside of the doorframe, could feel her heartbeat hammering in her ears. She had seen Sam fight before, once, in that gas station, but that was different. That was a warning shot. This was something else entirely. Javier's fingers twitched, his mind working overtime to regain control of the situation. He wasn't used to this. He was used to men backing down, to fear in their eyes, to people breaking under his threats. But Sam wasn't afraid, and that terrified him more than anything. "I'm done talking," Sam said, his voice low, steady. "You've got 5 seconds to get on those bikes and ride out of here, or I put you in the ground." The words weren't shouted, they weren't barked. They were spoken like a fact, like something inevitable, like the sun rising in the morning. Javier's jaw clenched. He couldn't back down, not in front of his men, not in front of Maria. His pride wouldn't allow it, but his instincts screamed at him to walk away. The silence stretched. A bead of sweat slid down the side of Javier's temple. Sam didn't move. Luis and Carlos exchanged a look. Neither of them had signed up for this. They had done their fair share of intimidation, of shaking down weak men, of making people fear their names. But this wasn't fear. This was something else, something final. And suddenly, they weren't sure if they were on the right side of this fight. "Javier," Luis muttered again, his voice tighter this time. "Maybe we should just go." Javier's lip curled. He wasn't going to let some washed-up old man run him out of town. But before he could respond, Sam did something that made every muscle in Javier's body lock up. He smirked. It was a small thing, barely there, but it carried more weight than 1,000 threats. It was the smirk of a man who had already won. 3 seconds, Sam murmured. The wind picked up, rustling through the dry grass. Javier's pulse pounded in his ears. He glanced back at his men, saw the hesitation in their eyes, the way their hands hovered near their belts but didn't reach. They weren't going to back him up if he pushed this further. He was alone. His pride and his rage warred inside him, but deep down, he knew he had lost. He spit on the ground, his teeth grinding together. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "You have no idea who you just messed with." Sam exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "I know exactly who I messed with," he said. "A coward." Javier's fists clenched. But he didn't say another word. He turned on his heel, stalking toward his bike. Luis and Carlos didn't hesitate. They mounted their rides immediately, engines roaring to life. Javier swung his leg over, glaring at Sam one last time. "This ain't over," he muttered. Sam just watched as they peeled out, dust kicking up behind them, their headlights fading into the night. Only when the last echo of their engines disappeared did Sam finally lower his rifle. Maria stepped out, her breath shaky. "They're gone," she whispered. Sam nodded but didn't relax. For now." The wind howled through the open fields, and in the distance, a coyote cried out into the night. Sam turned back toward the house, his jaw set. He knew men like Javier. They didn't give up. They didn't walk away. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Sam stood motionless, the dust from the departing bike still settling in the air. Maria took a hesitant step forward, her voice low. "They'll be back, won't they?" Sam didn't answer right away. He simply exhaled, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "Men like that don't take well to losing." He finally turned to her, his eyes calm but serious. "You should get inside, lock the doors, keep the rifle close." Maria clenched her jaw, frustration flickering in her eyes. "I'm not just going to hide while you take them on alone." Sam offered her a faint smile, but there was steel behind it. "I know you're not, but if they come back, I need you smart, not reckless." He stepped past her, pushing the door open. "Get some rest. I'll keep watch." Maria hesitated, but she saw the look in his eyes, the unwavering certainty of a man who had been through far worse. She nodded slowly and stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. Sam walked back to the porch, lowering himself into the old wooden chair, his rifle resting across his lap. The night stretched on, silent save for the occasional rustle of wind through the fields. Hours passed, but Sam never moved. He was waiting. He had been in this kind of standoff before, one where the real fight didn't start until after the enemy licked their wounds and decided they couldn't walk away. At nearly 3 a.m., the sound came, faint at first, but unmistakable. The distant hum of engines cutting through the quiet night. Sam didn't react, didn't tense, didn't even blink. He just inhaled deeply, rolling his shoulders as he reached down and adjusted the grip on his rifle. The engines grew louder. Then headlights appeared, moving fast down the dirt road toward the farm. Sam counted 3, maybe 4 bikes. The dust kicked up behind them, silhouetted in the pale moonlight. He heard Maria's footsteps behind him. "They're here," she whispered. Sam nodded. "Get upstairs. Stay out of sight." She hesitated, but this time she listened. The bikes roared as they skidded to a stop just outside the house. Javier was the first off, ripping off his helmet and tossing it to the ground. His face was twisted in fury, his pride still stinging from their last encounter. Luis and Carlos followed, but they weren't smiling this time. They looked uneasy, like they had realized just how badly this situation had escalated. Behind them, another figure dismounted, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running from his temple down to his jaw. Someone new, someone worse. Sam's eyes flicked toward him, assessing. This one wasn't just another thug. The way he moved, the way he scanned the surroundings, this was a fighter, a killer. Javier spat on the ground, pointing a finger at Sam. "You think you humiliated me, old man? Think you can just embarrass me in front of my men and get away with it?" His voice was laced with rage, but beneath it, there was something else. Fear. Sam leaned back in his chair, still as relaxed as ever. "You came back," he said, voice even. "Figured you might." Javier's hand twitched toward his waistband, but the scarred man behind him stepped forward, placing a firm grip on his shoulder. "Let's not make the same mistake twice," the man said, his voice rough and deliberate. His cold gaze locked onto Sam. "You're not just some old farmer, are you?" Sam said nothing. The scarred man smirked. "I did some digging. Samuel Brooks, former Marine, Recon Division, saw action in Iraq and Afghanistan. 2 confirmed sniper kills, 3 unconfirmed." He let out a slow breath. "Hell of a resume." Sam didn't flinch. "That was a long time ago." Javier's frustration flared. "What the hell does it matter?" he barked. "I don't care who he was. He's nothing now." He reached for his pistol. In a flash, Sam moved. 1 second he was seated. The next, his rifle was up, the barrel aimed directly at Javier's chest. His finger rested lightly on the trigger. "Try it," Sam murmured. The air went deathly still. Luis and Carlos shifted uncomfortably. Even the scarred man's smirk faltered. Sam's eyes never left Javier. "You pull that gun, and I promise you, you won't have time to use it." Javier hesitated, his knuckles white around the grip of his pistol. His breath came short and fast. "You don't have the guts." Sam exhaled through his nose. "You're standing in front of a man who spent a decade putting people like you in the ground," he said quietly. "The only reason you're still breathing is because I'm giving you the chance to walk away." The scarred man stepped between them, holding up a hand. "Enough," he ordered. "We aren't here to get killed." He turned back to Sam, his expression unreadable. "We're leaving." Javier's eyes snapped to him. "What? You're just going to let this nobody win?" The scarred man's gaze darkened. "He already won." He nodded toward Sam. "And if you were half as smart as you think you are, you'd see it too." Javier looked ready to explode, but he didn't move. His pride was bruised, his ego shattered. He wanted blood, but not at the cost of his own life. Sam slowly lowered his rifle, but he didn't relax. "Not yet." "Smart choice," he said simply. The scarred man gave him a small nod, then turned back toward his bike. Luis and Carlos didn't hesitate to follow, relief etched across their faces. Javier, shaking with barely restrained rage, hesitated for just a moment longer before he too stormed back toward his ride. The engines roared to life. Javier shot one last venomous glare toward Sam. "This ain't over." Sam met his stare, unblinking. "Yes, it is." And with that, Javier revved his bike and tore off down the road, his men following close behind. Sam stood still, listening as the engines faded into the distance. Only when the last echo disappeared did he finally exhale. He turned back toward the house. Maria was standing in the doorway, her face pale but steady. "Is it over?" she asked. Sam nodded once. "For now." But deep down, he knew the truth. Some fights never really ended. The night stretched long after the bandits disappeared, but Sam didn't move from his post on the porch. He sat there, rifle across his lap, listening to the silence that followed, watching the dust settle from where the motorcycles had roared off. Maria leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, tension still evident in the tightness of her jaw. "They'll come back," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It wasn't a question. Sam nodded. "Maybe not tonight. Maybe not tomorrow. But men like Javier don't know how to take a loss. Their pride won't let them." He looked up at her then, his sharp green eyes unreadable. "You need to be ready when they do." Maria exhaled, stepping down onto the porch. "I'm not running," she said simply. "I'm not leaving. If they come back, I'll fight." Sam studied her for a long moment, something like pride flickering in his expression. "I know you will," he said finally. "But fighting isn't just about holding a gun. It's about knowing when to use it and when not to." Maria's gaze hardened. "Are you saying I should let them win?" "No," Sam said, shaking his head. "I'm saying you should let them think they have a choice. That's what keeps you alive." The quiet between them lingered, heavy but not uncomfortable. Maria turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the last traces of dust had long since settled. "You weren't just some soldier, were you?" she asked. Sam let out a slow breath. "No." She turned to face him fully. "Then what were you?" For the first time since the encounter, Sam hesitated. His hands tightened just slightly on the rifle, his eyes distant. "I was a hunter," he said finally. "Not the kind that chases deer, the kind that tracks men." Maria's breath hitched slightly. She had suspected, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. "You were a sniper." Sam nodded once. "Recon. We did things most people don't want to hear about. And the men we hunted, they never saw us coming." Maria studied him, saw the way his shoulders remained loose, but his eyes were calculating, always measuring, always planning. Even now, even in the quiet, he was assessing the world as a battlefield. "And yet," she murmured, "you settled here. A quiet little farm in Texas. Everyone's got to rest sometime," Sam said, a ghost of a smile crossing his lips. "Even ghosts." A rustling sound from the barn made them both turn sharply. Maria's fingers twitched toward her belt, where she kept a knife, but Sam didn't move. He simply listened. A moment later, a dark shape slipped from the shadows. A dog, lean and battle-worn. its ribs faintly visible beneath a rough coat. It limped slightly as it trotted closer, ears perked but eyes cautious. "Where'd he come from?" Maria asked. Sam leaned forward slightly, studying the animal. "Nowhere good," he murmured. He clicked his tongue softly, and the dog hesitated before slowly padding closer. Its eyes flicked toward Maria's, uncertain, but when it turned back to Sam, there was something in its gaze. Recognition, maybe trust. The dog stopped at the porch, head low, as if waiting for permission. Sam reached out a hand, slow, deliberate. The dog didn't flinch, just sniffed once before pressing its nose into his palm. "Smart boy," Sam murmured. "Knows how to pick his allies." Maria crouched beside him. "Think he was with them?" Sam glanced at the dog's ribs, the old scars along its flank. "Maybe once, but he's not now." They sat there for a moment, just watching the dog settle at Sam's feet, curling up as if it had always belonged there. "He needs a name," Maria said. Sam considered. "Reckon he does." He looked down at the mutt, who lifted his head slightly at the sound of Sam's voice. "How about Ghost?" Maria smirked. "Fitting." The dog gave a soft huff, curling tighter against Sam's boots. For the first time that night, some of the tension in Maria's shoulders eased. But Sam knew better than to let his guard down. The next morning, Sam was already up before the sun, the faint glow of dawn barely touching the horizon. He stood by the fence watching the fields, Ghost sitting at his feet. Maria joined him a few minutes later, stretching out the stiffness from a restless sleep. "Anything?" she asked. Sam shook his head. "Not yet." He didn't say, but soon. He didn't have to. Maria sighed. "So what do we do now?" Sam turned to face her. "We prepare." He nodded toward the barn. "Got an old rifle in there. Not the best, but it'll do." Maria raised an eyebrow. "You're arming me." "I'm making sure you don't get killed," Sam corrected. "Ain't the same thing." Maria followed him into the barn, where Sam reached into an old chest and pulled out a Winchester repeater, the metal aged but well-maintained. He handed it to Maria. She took it, testing the weight, her grip firm but cautious. "Ever shot one of these?" Sam asked. Maria smirked. "What do you think?" She lifted the rifle smoothly, aiming at a wooden post across the barn, steady as a seasoned gunslinger. Sam nodded approvingly. "I guess I don't need to teach you much." "No," Maria said, lowering the rifle, "but you can show me how to shoot like you." Sam studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's get started." The next few hours passed in a rhythm of practice and precision. Sam showed Maria the finer points of aiming, controlling breath, knowing when to shoot and when to wait. She picked it up faster than most men he'd trained. By noon, she was hitting her marks dead on. As Maria reloaded for another round, she glanced at Sam. "When they come back," she said, voice steady, "we won't run, will we?" Sam shook his head. "No," he said simply. Maria exhaled, then lifted the rifle, sighting down the barrel. She pulled the trigger, the bullet hit dead center. They were ready. The sun hung low in the Texas sky, painting the horizon in streaks of gold and blood red, as Sam and Maria stood side by side on the porch, Ghost curled up at their feet. The air was thick with the scent of dust and sweat, the quiet before the storm palpable in the stillness of the land. Sam's instincts had been screaming at him since dawn, a feeling he knew better than to ignore. The bandits weren't gone. They were regrouping, waiting for nightfall to strike when they thought he would be vulnerable. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Maria had spent the last few hours honing her aim, every shot hitting true. The nervous determination in her eyes had transformed into something colder, more focused. Sam recognized that look. It was the same one he had seen in the eyes of men before a battle, a mixture of fear and resolve that sharpened into something lethal. The first sign of trouble came as the wind shifted, carrying the distant hum of engines. Sam tensed, his fingers tightening around the worn stock of his rifle. Maria heard it too, her grip on the Winchester firm. "They're coming," she murmured. Sam nodded. Right on time. A single headlight appeared on the dusty road leading up to the farmhouse, followed by another, then another. The roar of motorcycles grew louder, the unmistakable sound of men who thought they owned the night. Sam exhaled slowly, watching as the bandits emerged from the darkness, their silhouettes sharp against the last light of the setting sun. Javier was at the front, his smug grin visible even from a distance. He raised a hand, signaling his men to fan out. Maria swallowed hard, but when she turned to Sam, her jaw was set. "What's the plan?" Sam rolled his shoulders. "We hold the line." He gestured toward the barn. "You take the high ground. Hayloft gives you a clear view. Aim for the tires if they try to run." Maria hesitated only a second before nodding and slipping away into the shadows, disappearing inside the barn with Ghost at her heels. Sam stepped forward, his boots kicking up dust as he met Javier's gaze. The outlaw dismounted, his men doing the same, spreading out in a loose semicircle. "Señor," Javier greeted, voice dripping with mock politeness. "We have unfinished business." Sam's expression didn't change. "I told you once, this land isn't yours." "It never will be," Javier chuckled, shaking his head. "You're an old man playing cowboy, gringo. You should have taken my offer when you had the chance." He snapped his fingers, and one of his men stepped forward, carrying a jerry can. The scent of gasoline filled the air. "One last chance, go, viejo. Walk away and I let you live." Sam didn't blink. "That's so." His voice was steady, calm, but Javier caught the glint in his eyes. Something unsettling, something that made him hesitate. A gunshot rang out. Javier's smirk vanished as one of his men collapsed, clutching his knee and screaming in pain. Maria's shot had been perfect, precise, deliberate. Sam barely spared a glance toward the barn. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was thick with tension, the remaining bandits shifting uneasily. Javier's expression darkened, his hand twitching toward his pistol. "Big mistake," he growled. Sam moved before he could draw. One fluid motion, like a memory stitched into his bones. His rifle came up, the barrel leveled, and a single shot split the air. The gun in Javier's grip was knocked clean from his hand, the impact sending it skidding across the dirt. The outlaw let out a sharp hiss of pain, clutching his wrist, eyes wide in disbelief. Chaos erupted. The bandits scrambled for cover, gunfire cracking through the night, but Sam was already moving, his stance solid, his shots precise. He didn't waste bullets. Every squeeze of the trigger was measured, every shot calculated. Maria provided cover from the barn, picking off the men who tried to flank. One of the outlaws broke for his bike, but Ghost lunged from the shadows, snarling as he took the man down, his jaws clamping onto an arm. The bandit screamed, thrashing against the dog's grip. Javier, still clutching his injured wrist, stumbled backward, watching his men fall apart. This was supposed to be easy. An old man and a girl weren't supposed to put up a fight, but this wasn't just an old man. This was a warrior. Sam ducked behind the porch railing as bullets whizzed past, reloading with practiced ease. He spotted movement to his left, one of the bandits creeping along the fence line, thinking he could flank. Sam sighed. He pivoted, raised his rifle, and fired. The outlaw crumpled. Javier's breath came in ragged gasps as he looked around, realizing he was alone. The others were either down, retreating, or too injured to fight. He stumbled toward his bike, but before he could reach it, a boot slammed into his chest, knocking him flat on his back. Maria stood over him, rifle aimed at his head, her breathing heavy but steady. "Not so tough now, are you?" she said, voice like steel. Javier coughed, spitting dust. His good hand twitched toward his belt, reaching for a hidden knife. Maria fired. The bullet grazed his shoulder, close enough to sear flesh but not enough to kill. Javier screamed, clutching the wound. "Next one goes between your eyes," Maria said coldly. Sam stepped forward, his shadow looming over the fallen outlaw. "You ride out of here," he said quietly. "And you tell every man you work with what happened. You tell them this land isn't for the taking." Javier's lips curled into a snarl, but he saw no mercy in either of their faces. He spat in the dirt, but gave a slow nod. "You win, viejo." Sam stepped back. "Go!" Javier scrambled to his feet, staggering toward his bike. He climbed on, revving the engine, and without another word, he rode into the night, disappearing into the darkness. Maria exhaled sharply, lowering her rifle. Ghost padded up to her, licking the blood off his muzzle. Sam turned to face her. "You all right?" She nodded, wiping sweat from her brow. "Yeah." Then she smirked. "You." Sam chuckled, shouldering his rifle. "I'll live." They stood there for a moment, watching the dust settle, the stars shining cold and bright overhead. "Come on," Sam finally said. We got work to do. Maria raised an eyebrow. What now? Sam glanced toward the barn. Gotta bury the ones who didn't make it. She sighed but nodded, slinging the rifle over her shoulder. All right, old man, let's get to it. They walked side by side into the night, Ghost trailing behind, the land around them quiet once more. The dust had barely settled, but Sam knew this wasn't over. Javier might have ridden off, tail between his legs, but men like him didn't stay beaten for long. He'd be back. Maybe not tonight, maybe not even tomorrow, but he'd return, and he wouldn't come alone. Sam had seen it before in war zones, in towns like this, where men with more ambition than sense thought they could carve out a piece of the world by force. He ran a hand over his rifle, his mind already working through the possibilities. Maria stood beside him, her knuckles white around the grip of her Winchester, her breathing still heavy from the fight. Ghost prowled the perimeter, his ears twitching at every sound. "Do you think he'll be back?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. Sam exhaled, shifting his weight as he stared down the road where Javier had disappeared. Men like him always come back, but he won't make the same mistake twice. He glanced at her. Neither should we. Maria nodded, wiping sweat and dirt from her brow. She wasn't the same girl who had been too afraid to pull the trigger just days ago. She had stepped into something far bigger than herself, and she hadn't flinched. That counted for something. They moved quickly, securing the property, making sure every possible entry point was covered. Sam set up tripwires near the back fence, where the land sloped into a dry creek bed, an easy access point for someone trying to sneak up under cover of night. Maria reloaded, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. As the night deepened, the cicadas quieted, leaving only the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Sam sat on the porch, rifle across his lap, his eyes on the road. Maria joined him after a while, her gaze distant. "You ever get tired of it?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Of what?" "The fighting. Always having to look over your shoulder." Sam chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't get tired of it, Maria. You just learn to live with it." A beat of silence passed between them. Then Ghost's ears perked up and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Sam followed the dog's gaze to the tree line. Movement, shadows shifting in the moonlight. "Go inside," he said, his voice low. Maria hesitated. "Sam, go," he repeated, already standing. She obeyed, slipping through the doorway, but he knew she wouldn't stay put for long. A single figure stepped out of the trees, hands raised in mock surrender. Javier, alone, or so he wanted Sam to believe. "Senor Hayes," he called out, voice carrying in the stillness. "We have unfinished business." Sam's grip tightened around his rifle, but he didn't raise it. "Not yet." "Looks to me like you already got your answer." Javier smirked, taking another step forward. "You're right, I did, which is why I brought reinforcements." The words had barely left his lips when the sound of engines filled the air. More bikes, a lot more. From the tree line and the road, figures emerged, dozens of them, their silhouettes dark against the moonlit landscape. They weren't just armed, they were ready. Javier grinned, his confidence back. "Now, viejo, we settle this properly." Sam exhaled through his nose, calm despite the odds. He'd been in worse situations, but never alone. Except he wasn't. A sharp crack rang through the air, and one of Javier's men dropped, clutching his leg. From the window, Maria leveled her rifle for another shot. Sam smiled. "You boys sure you want to do this?" Javier's smirk faltered, but he didn't back down. "You can't win this one, gringo." Sam's stance shifted, his rifle coming up smoothly. "I will see about that." The night exploded into gunfire. The first shots rang out like thunder in the still night, the muzzle flashes illuminating the darkened landscape in bursts of fire. Sam dropped to one knee behind the wooden porch railing, his rifle barking as he returned fire with precision. His first shot took down the closest outlaw, sending the man spinning to the dirt with a cry of pain. Maria, perched behind the window inside the house, was just as deadly. Her shots were calculated, her aim steady. Every time one of Javier's men tried to advance, a well-placed bullet forced them to retreat or drop where they stood. Javier ducked behind a low rock formation, cursing as bullets chipped away at the ground near him. "Push forward," he shouted, waving his men toward the house. The gang scattered, using the darkness and terrain to their advantage. Two men sprinted toward the barn, attempting to flank from the side, but Sam had anticipated it. He took them both down before they even reached the entrance. The others pressed forward, sending rounds into the porch, splintering wood and shattering glass. Inside, Maria reloaded quickly, her breathing controlled. She felt the vibrations of Ghost growling beside her, the dog sensing the danger. "Sam, they're moving toward the back," she called out, her voice steady. Sam adjusted his position, rolling behind an overturned feed barrel. "I got him." He fired twice, taking out another attacker who had dared to climb over the fence. The gang was realizing something now. They weren't hunting a defenseless old farmer. They were up against a warrior. Javier gritted his teeth, watching his men fall one by one. This was supposed to be an easy job, a quick kill. Instead, it had turned into a war, and they were losing. "Enough of this," he growled. He pulled a flare from his jacket and lit it, tossing it onto the dry grass near the house. Within seconds, the flames spread, licking hungrily at the ground. The fire was meant to be a distraction, and it worked. Sam saw the glow, smelled the smoke, and knew they had only minutes before it became uncontrollable. He had to end this now. With practiced ease, he slung his rifle over his back and drew his revolver. "Maria, cover me," he barked. Then he moved. Charging forward with the speed of a much younger man, he closed the distance between himself and Javier's position. The gang leader barely had time to register what was happening before Sam was on him. The barrel of the revolver pressed against his temple. "Call them off," Sam ordered, his voice low and unyielding. Javier's jaw clenched. "You wouldn't." Sam cocked the hammer. "Try me." For a long moment, Javier weighed his options. The gunfire had slowed. His men were either dead, wounded, or too scared to fight. The flames behind them crackled, growing higher. Finally, he exhaled sharply and lifted his hands. "Stand down," he shouted. The remaining outlaws hesitated, then lowered their weapons. Sam didn't move the gun away. "You listen close," he said, his voice cold as steel. "You and your kind, you're done here. This land, this town, it ain't yours to take. You so much as breathe in this direction again, I'll make sure you don't breathe at all." Javier swallowed hard, nodding stiffly. Sam stepped back. "Get your men." "Get out." Javier scrambled to his feet, waving his crew toward their bikes, one by one. They mounted up, battered, broken, and beaten. Without another word, they roared off into the night, their tail lights disappearing into the darkness. Maria stepped out onto the porch, rifle still in hand, watching them go. "Think they'll stay gone?" Sam holstered his gun, staring after them. "If they got any sense, they will." The fire had reached the fence line, but with quick work they managed to smother it before it spread to the house. The night smelled of smoke and gunpowder, but the air carried something else too: victory. Maria let out a long breath, leaning against the porch railing. "Hell of a night," Sam chuckled, shaking his head. "Ain't over yet." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the house. "We got cleanup to do." Maria groaned, but a small smile tugged at her lips. "You ever take a break, old man?" Sam glanced at her, then at the land he had fought to protect. "Not when there's work to be done." Together, they turned toward the house, the first hints of dawn beginning to creep over the horizon. As the dust settled and the last echoes of the gunfight faded into the night, Sam stood in the center of his property, revolver still gripped tightly in his weathered hand. His sharp eyes followed the trail of taillights as Javier and his gang disappeared down the dirt road, their engines fading into the distance. The fire they had set still smoldered along the fence line, small flames licking at the wooden posts. Sam moved quickly, grabbing a shovel and dirt, stomping out the remaining embers with practiced efficiency. Maria, rifle slung over her shoulder, stood by his side, the adrenaline still pumping through her veins. "Shall you think that's the last of them?" she asked, voice calm despite the chaos they'd just endured. Sam exhaled slowly, running a hand through his silvered hair. "No," he admitted. "Men like that don't forget humiliation easy. But they sure as hell won't come back tonight." He turned his gaze to the bodies lying scattered around the property. They had won this battle, but there would be consequences. Maria frowned, reading his expression. "Then what do we do?" she asked. Sam slid his revolver back into its holster and adjusted his stance. "We prepare," he said simply. The night air was thick with the scent of burnt wood and gunpowder. The quiet that followed the fight felt unnatural, too still, too expectant. Sam had been through too many wars, too many conflicts to trust in silence. He knew it was only a matter of time before Javier regrouped, licking his wounds and seeking revenge. He needed to be ready. But first, there were dead men on his land, and that was a problem that needed solving before dawn. They worked in silence, dragging the bodies to the back pasture, covering them with tarps. Sam would deal with them properly in the morning. As they finished, Ghost, ever loyal, sniffed at the ground, his hackles raised slightly. He wasn't comfortable yet. That made two of them. Maria finally spoke. "So what now, Sam? What's the plan?" Sam took a deep breath, looking at the land he'd spent his whole life protecting. "We fortify. We watch. And when they come back, because they will, we end this for good." His voice was low, edged with the weight of experience. Maria nodded, gripping her rifle a little tighter. "Then I guess I'm staying." Sam smirked slightly. "Wasn't planning on giving you a choice." As the first light of dawn began to paint the horizon in soft hues of pink and orange, Sam Hayes stood tall, staring out over his land. The war wasn't over, not yet. But one thing was certain. When the fight came knocking again, he'd be ready. As the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, the aftermath of the battle was clear. Bodies of fallen outlaws scattered across the dirt, bullet casings glinting under the rising sun, and the lingering scent of gunpowder mixed with smoke from the small fire that had nearly consumed the barn. Sam stood on the porch, revolver still in hand, his grip steady despite the exhaustion settling into his old bones. Maria stepped beside him, her rifle still shouldered, her face streaked with sweat and dirt, but her eyes sharp, scanning the empty road where the gang had fled. The night's battle had taken its toll, but they had won. For now, Sam holstered his revolver and exhaled slowly, watching as the last remnants of Javier's gang disappeared beyond the ridge. He knew better than to assume this was over for good. Men like Javier didn't take kindly to being beaten, and though he had been forced to retreat, revenge was a seed that could be planted deep in a man's pride. Sam had seen it before, countless times on battlefields far from home, but this land was his battlefield now, and he wasn't about to surrender it. Maria wiped her brow, letting out a breath that was half relief, half exasperation. "So, what now?" she asked, glancing at Sam, her expression caught between exhaustion and admiration. Sam gave a tired chuckle, stretching his shoulders as he surveyed the damage. "Now we clean up," she scoffed, shaking her head. "You ever think about taking it easy, old man?" Sam turned to her, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Taking it easy is how you get soft." He motioned toward the front yard, where Ghost was sniffing around the fallen men, making sure none of them were foolish enough to still be breathing. "Gotta make sure these bodies get handled. Sheriff will want to see 'em." Maria nodded, slinging her rifle over her back. "I'll start dragging them to the road. Sheriff Matthews will have a field day with this." As she walked off, Sam turned his gaze toward the rising sun. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and pink, the beauty of the morning a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. His fingers grazed the grip of his revolver, feeling the familiar weight that had been with him through countless fights. He had once thought he could leave this kind of life behind, trade war for peace, but life had a way of pulling a man back into the fray whether he wanted it or not. Footsteps behind him signaled Maria's return. "Sam," she called, her tone different now, more cautious. He turned to see her standing near one of the fallen outlaws, staring down at something in her hand. He stepped closer and saw it was a silver emblem, the kind carried by members of a cartel. His jaw tightened. "Javier wasn't just some gang leader," she said, turning the emblem over in her palm. "He was connected." Sam's expression darkened. "That explains why they were so well equipped." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his beard. "Means this ain't over." Maria clenched her fist around the emblem. "So what do we do?" Sam looked out over his land, the place he had built with his own hands, the home he had fought for. "We do what we always do," he said, voice steady. "We stand our ground." Maria met his gaze, understanding settling between them. There was no running, no hiding. This was their home, and they'd defend it with everything they had. The wind rustled through the fields, the first real breath of morning filling the air. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. a sound that had once blended into the background of everyday life, but now felt like a warning. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The first rays of the morning sun stretched over the land, casting long shadows across the battlefield that had once been a peaceful farm. Sam stood by the fence, watching as Maria dragged the last of the bodies to the roadside, where Sheriff Matthews would soon arrive. Ghost sat beside him, his ears perked up, still on high alert. The smell of burnt wood lingered in the air, a reminder of the destruction Javier's men had brought with them, but they hadn't won. Sam had fought too many wars to let men like them take what was his. He ran a hand over his revolver before sliding it back into his holster, the metal still warm from use. Maria walked over, wiping the sweat from her forehead, her eyes sharp with thought. "You really think they'll be back?" she asked, glancing at the emblem she had taken from the dead outlaw's pocket. Sam exhaled, his gaze fixed on the distant road. "If Javier has any pride left, he'll come back. Not today, maybe not tomorrow. But men like him don't let things go." Maria clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around the rifle strap over her shoulder. "Then we get ready." Sam nodded. "We don't just get ready. We make sure that when they come back, they don't leave." The wind carried the scent of the open plains, rustling through the scorched grass. A quiet moment of stillness before whatever storm was bound to follow. Sheriff Matthews arrived not long after, his truck pulling up in a cloud of dust, his expression shifting from concern to grim understanding as he stepped out and surveyed the bodies lined up along the dirt road. "Jesus, Sam," the sheriff muttered, pushing his hat back on his head. "How you've been busy." Sam crossed his arms, watching as the sheriff knelt by one of the fallen men, examining the silver emblem Maria had found. "You recognize it?" Sam asked. Matthews sighed. "Yeah, cartel affiliated. These weren't just a bunch of troublemakers looking to steal cattle. You stirred up something bigger." Maria tensed, shifting beside Sam. "We didn't stir up anything. They came here looking for a fight." Matthews gave a tired nod. "That may be, but it doesn't change the fact that trouble's coming. The cartel doesn't take losses lightly." Sam remained silent for a long moment, staring out past the horizon, where the morning light shimmered off the distant hills. He had spent a lifetime fighting battles, some on foreign soil, some in his own backyard. This was no different. "Let 'em come," he finally said, his voice steady, unshaken. The sheriff studied him for a beat before shaking his head. "You always were the stubborn one, Sam. Just don't get yourself killed." He turned toward his deputies, signaling them to start loading the bodies into the truck. Maria watched them work before turning to Sam. "We have to be smart about this. If Javier's got cartel ties, he won't come alone next time." Sam nodded. "I know, that's why we prepare." The day wore on, and as the bodies were taken away, the land seemed to breathe again, but the scars remained. By evening, Sam and Maria had reinforced the property, securing weak spots along the fence line, double-checking their supplies. The farm wasn't just home. It was a stronghold now. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of amber and deep blue, Sam sat on the porch, Ghost lying at his feet. Maria joined him, handing him a glass of whiskey. "You ever get tired of this?" she asked. Sam chuckled, taking a slow sip. "Every damn day," she smirked, leaning back against the porch railing. "And yet, here we are." Sam glanced at her, a flicker of something like pride in his gaze. "Here we are," he agreed. The night settled in, the quiet wrapping around them like an old familiar friend. But both knew the peace wouldn't last. Trouble was on the horizon, but Sam had faced worse. He had spent his life fighting, and if this was one more battle, so be it. The outlaws had tried to take what was his. They had underestimated the old man on the farm. That was their first mistake. If they came back, it would be their last. The stars stretched wide over the Texas sky, the land vast and endless. But Sam wasn't afraid. He had fought for his home before. He would do it again, and this time he wouldn't be alone. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of justice, grit, and survival. And if you like this one, check out the next video. It's another tale of standing strong when the odds are stacked against you. Click now and keep the adventure going.